Welcome to Focus, Faith, and Fueling, the Winning Edge podcast, where young athletes, parents, and coaches learn how mindset, nutrition, and faith work together to elevate performance, resilience, and overall health.
What you eat and how you think can elevate and transform your game. If you're ready to gain a true mental edge, fuel your body with purpose, and stay grounded in what truly matters, then this podcast is for you.
We are your hosts. I'm Lindsay, former collegiate athlete, author, coach, and educational coach for over 20 years, and a mom to two young athletes.
And I'm Stacy, sports dietitian, author, speaker, and nutritional consultant for over 19 years, and a mom of two teen athletes. Today, we're sitting down with someone who truly gets what it takes to fuel athletes at every stage of the game, from the youth playing fields all the way to the pros. Mandy Tyler is a sports dietitian nutritionist based in San Antonio, Texas, with over 15 years of experience working with high school, collegiate, and professional athletes. She currently serves as the sports dietitian for both the San Antonio Spurs and Austin Spurs, and chairs the NBA's Performance Dietitian Practice Group. And if that wasn't enough, Mandy is also a contributing author to the upcoming 7th edition of Nancy Clark's Sports Nutrition Guidebook, one of the most trusted references in the field, dropping in 2027. Today, we're diving into an essential and, let's be honest, sometimes uncomfortable topic: recognizing and preventing eating disorders in young athletes. These issues often start quietly, but the ripple effects can be long-lasting, touching everything from physical health and performance to an athlete's sense of self and identity. And here's something that might surprise you. Research shows that young athletes are actually at higher risk for disordered eating than their non-athlete peers. These behaviors can disrupt growth, bone health, hormone health, and even cardiovascular function. So today's conversation isn't just about preventing eating disorders or disordered patterns of eating. It's about protecting the long-term health and identity of every young athlete we coach, raise, and care for. Mandy, thank you for being on with us today. I'm excited to have you, given your wealth of knowledge in this space and the fact that you're finishing co-authoring a new book, right?
That's right. I'm really excited to be co-author of Nancy Clark's Sports Nutrition Guidebook, her 7th edition. So really excited about that. Nancy Clark is just such a figure in sports nutrition here in the United States. And it's such
I've got her
honor.
books from when I was in college and high school.
Yes, exactly.
Well, congratulations. That's amazing. And so I hope our listeners can understand just sort of the depth of knowledge you must have as a sports dietitian to be able to contribute to a work like that with someone who is so well known in the sports nutrition space. And I'm even more excited today. I know you guys are, for those that don't know you and just got to hear a little about you, you guys are finishing season and you're with the San Antonio Spurs, which we love. I grew up in the San Antonio area. Tell us a little bit about what that's like before we jump into our topic.
Yeah, so definitely been a fun season. We're winding down, getting ready for playoffs. So I'm their team dietitian. And so just help with every aspect of nutrition for the players, including menu planning, as well as just like hydration and supplements and everything the players might need to support their performance on the court.
Yeah, which it's been working. We're winning.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, and I'm excited to have you today to talk about the topic that we're talking about because it can be a very sensitive topic. I'd love you to set some background, given your host of experience in sports nutrition, with what we see in this space with young athletes, with college level athletes, and recognizing and working to prevent these like patterns of disordered eating and eating disorders that we can commonly see in this population or audience.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct, Stacy. When we're talking about eating disorders, disordered eating in athletes, we do know that from studies that the prevalence does seem to be more common in the athletic population versus the non-athletic population. Studies have shown that in female athletes, it could be as high as 45% of female athletes and 19% of male athletes are experiencing either disordered eating or eating disorder symptoms. And that's concerning. I will just say seeing middle school, high school athletes for sure with concerns of disordered eating. And so I'm glad that you brought this topic forward to the podcast because I think early identification, parents and coaches, just to be aware of possible signs and symptoms. I mean, that's really the first step in prevention is just the education.
Coaches, even doctors. You and I were kind of briefly talking about this, but I'm speaking to a group of pediatricians coming up and helping them screen for these young children who might be athletes, especially you mentioned that it's, more common in athletes than it can be in other children, but also I see more commonly in weight-based sports where it's
Yep.
intentioned on a body weight. Do you see that as well?
That's absolutely correct. So weight class sports, so like a wrestling or rowing or
Yeah.
boxing, those are all perfect examples. But we also see it in sports that emphasize appearance. So things like gymnastics or dance or bodybuilding could all be issues. Even volleyball, think about the uniforms that they're being asked to
Yeah.
wear. Like those can all be triggers, for increased risk of eating disorders. We also tend to see it in our endurance athletes. So athletes who are doing running or cycling or distance swimming, just because that's what they see first and foremost. When you look at elite runners, they tend to be thinner, but then also, if they're lighter weight, then that perception of that they're going to be able to run better. So those are kind of the more common sports, but I also think it's important to recognize that it can happen in any athlete at any time, right? So we do see it in football players. We do see it in basketball players or softball players. Those are occurrences as well. And so I don't want to just say, just look at these weight class sports because then we may be missing athletes.
No, that's the great advice. So, explain for our listeners really the difference between disordered eating, an eating disorder, and then something like REDS that we can see in young athletes. Can you kind of
Yeah.
speak to those for us?
Absolutely. Yeah, and Stacey, I heard your interview that you did with Rebecca on Reds, and so that was a great one. So I definitely
He's so
recommend
great.
listeners go back. She's phenomenal. So really a great question. And so when we think about disordered eatings and eating disorders, I like to say it kind of exists on a spectrum from disordered eating. Maybe an athlete occasionally has some type of eating or exercise behavior that we would consider problematic versus an eating disorder, which would be the other end of the spectrum. And that would be a diagnosed mental health condition. And so anything in between, kind of a spectrum on how frequently those behaviors might occur. But I would just like to tell parents any sign of disordered eating is worth addressing, right? We don't want to wait until it's a full blown eating disorder. We want to address these issues early on and correct them so that it doesn't turn into an eating disorder. And then you asked about REDS. So REDS is relative energy deficiency in sport. And so that's basically when there's an imbalance between calories expended in everyday activities plus sport, and then calories consumed. And so sometimes this can be due to disordered eating behaviors, but not always, right? I have seen athletes, especially like our high school athletes that are doing high school sports and club sports. They may be telling me, Mandy, I'm eating a lot, but maybe they need, 3,800 calories a day and they're only eating 2,800. So they do feel like they're eating a lot, but there's still 1,000 calorie gap, right? And so that's not due to disordered eating. That's just due to they need to eat more, right? And we can correct that. We need to because REDS, as you discussed with Rebecca, has numerous health implications and performance implications for athletes.
Yeah, and that's what I commonly see with athletes is oftentimes for a
Mhm.
lot of our young athletes, it's more they feel like they're eating a lot of calories,
Yeah,
that they aren't quite accomplishing the goal their body needs as they're going through
right,
puberty, as they're
right.
doing 2 or 3 a
Yes.
days, whatever that looks like. Talk to our listeners about how much of this is normal dedication to sport, training to be really good, um, how that can blur the lines around something we should really worry about as we see these young kiddos, as we think about our own children and sort of their relationship to food and how they're
Yeah,
using food as fueling.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be hard, especially in athletic population, because we have athletes who truly want to excel. They tend to be perfectionists, right? And they're going to do everything 100%, if not 110%. And so that line can be really blurry. But what I like to say is, are we doing things that in our intent to be excellent that we're actually hurting ourselves, right? We're not giving ourselves the fuel we need to reap the benefits of all that training they're doing, right? All the training they're doing on the field and in the weight room. If we're not getting adequate calories into them, they're not going to be reaping those benefits of the training. And then I also think you see, especially in the athletic population, you see this kind of morph into excessive exercise, right? When they're doing not just what the team has prescribed, not what the coaches has recommended, but they're doing additional exercise over and above what the coach recommended, all in the attempts of improving performance. At least that's initially the attempts of improving performance. But then it can almost become like a compulsion where they're doing extra laps in the pool after they're done with swim practice, or they're doing extra miles over and above what's been recommended by the coaches. And that's where that line kind of the scale kind of tips in the wrong direction and it become very problematic.
Yeah. How do you tell the difference between those 2? I guess as a parent
Yeah.
who's listening to this, like what's a healthy boundary? Because I think some parents would look at that and I
Mhm.
see this often. They would go, "Oh, that's awesome. That's great. They're really dedicated." But like, how do you've done this for a long time, really
Yep.
draw that boundary line?
Yeah, so especially when it comes to exercise, one question I like to know is your coach aware, right? Is your coach aware that you're doing this extra training? Are they training in secret, right? Are they training in maybe unsafe circumstances, maybe late at night when it's dark, or maybe in the inclement weather, right? So running in the rain or the freezing cold. I think that those are all kind of red flags. But like I said, the biggest question that I see is like, is your coach aware that you're doing this extra training, or has this been recommended by your coach or your strength coach? And also, if it becomes where you notice like it's very compulsive and rigid, like they have to do a certain number of sit ups or a certain number of laps, or they need to start over. So I think you can kind of look at that too, just the rigidity requirement with that exercise.
Yeah, that's really good feedback to think about in sort of the greater context of how they approach their lifestyle and really
Yeah.
having balance. We talk a lot about that in our book too. Or being a well-rounded child, because
Yes.
sometimes
Yes.
sports, especially our competitive young athletes, it can take over everything. What are some of the early behavioral signs that young athletes who are struggling with disordered eating or an eating disorder that you most commonly see?
Yeah. Yeah, signs that I commonly see, and I think parents can kind of just be on the watch for is just the beginning to restrict food intake. And so that could be like they start excessively counting calories or weighing or measuring food when they haven't done that in the past. Maybe they start eliminating certain food items and then it becomes a food group, right? And then multiple food groups. So this gradual decrease in the foods that they will allow themselves to eat. I also see like really fixation on like how is the food prepared? What type of oil, right? We're focused on
Mhm.
oil. What type of oil is in that? What kind of added ingredients is that? Maybe I've seen, working with one high school athlete, she wouldn't trust her mom to make the food because she was worried the mom would add something else into it. So I can only cook my food, only make my smoothie because I can't trust that what my mom might add into it. You also
Won't
start
give me
seeing kind of,
extra calories or won't give me extra,
yeah,
and then
exactly,
being very
exactly.
fearful. Okay, that's
Fearful,
helpful.
yeah. I think going back to kind of the ritualistic exercise, thinking about that kind of with food as well, like cutting food into very small pieces, eating very slowly, eating foods in certain orders, all becomes very ritualistic in how they even, consume the food once it's prepared. So I think those are some of kind of the big red flags that parents might notice. I think coaches or teammates might notice that athletes, they start avoiding team situations that involve food, right? So if they're, team dinners are common, especially as you get into high school and college, team meals are common. So maybe they're asking a ton of questions about food. Where's the food coming from? What's being served? What's being provided? Maybe bringing their own food to the team meal, which can be awkward, right? Or
Mm.
maybe just avoiding it altogether, right? Which obviously teammates are going to notice. So teammates might start sharing that. Coaches might start noticing that. Those should all be kind of red flags to you that maybe there's something going on.
Yeah, that's really great. I'm gonna veer us for a second.
Yeah.
What do you do when you're working with, and I know this is something I can struggle with sometimes, is when you have parents who are bringing a young athlete to you and they might be, and maybe parents are listening to this going, man, I struggle with disordered views of how
Yeah.
I see food, or maybe I have struggled historically. How do you
Yeah.
manage that from a family dynamic? And what advice would you give to our parents who have either historically struggled or maybe are going, I think I struggle with a disordered view of how I think about food. How do I help create this healthier environment for my young athlete? Like, what advice would you give them?
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely can be a struggle. And, as parents, we all want to do the best for our kids, right? And I always think like we always have to remember, like, even as professionals, we're all doing the best we can with the knowledge that we have. And so I think one of the best things that can help a family is to reframe the focus to food as fuel, right? And how are we fueling our bodies for activity and start the focus there. Take out the vocabulary of good and bad foods, right? Because we know all foods can fit into our young athletes' diets. So maybe some foods are for fueling activity and some foods are for enjoyment, and that is absolutely okay, right? And so take that focus on, are we giving ourselves the carbohydrates we need before we exercise? And families need that as a whole, right? And are we choosing the healthy carbohydrates maybe? And are we giving protein to build muscle mass, right? And are we choosing calcium rich dairy products for, building strong bones? And so going back to what is food doing for us versus sometimes food almost becomes the enemy. And that's not our goal. We want food to be fueling our bodies and focusing on how it helps us perform and keeps our bodies healthy. I think can be a big help, and especially in a family dynamic.
Yeah, and just understanding that nutrition because food is fuel, nutrition can be so different. And to your point earlier, for a
Mhm.
young athlete who's burning 4 or 5,000 calories a day,
Yeah.
and a woman who's in her 40s, 50s,
Yeah.
who's raising that young
Mhm.
athlete. And so I think, one of the things I see, and it's unfortunate, is that sometimes nutrition for an adult who's moderating their weight or managing their health can get transitioned down. There can be a real fear of carbohydrates in a
Mhm.
household, or a
Yes.
real fear of some sort of ingredient, but that athlete needs to refuel those
Mhm.
glycogen stores.
Yep.
And so,
Yep.
more carbohydrates at breakfast, lunch, and dinner is
Yes.
actually exactly what they need.
Yes. Yes.
And it's hard to make up. I'll often see this tension with athletes need to eat more in households like that, but they're so afraid of carbs, they're trying to eat more in protein or fats. And those are such like satiating, filling
Right.
nutrients that the athlete simply can't add any more to their plate because they're just too
Correct.
full.
Correct. And I probably you see the same as I do. I feel like one of the biggest mistakes I see young athletes make is they're over consuming protein and just not consuming enough carbohydrates in their diet. So sometimes I think we need to really be working with families on how can we get the most carbohydrates with the little chewing possible, right? So can we be doing a fruit smoothie? Can we be adding in things like granola or a bagel or something that's really carbohydrate dense? So the athlete, like you said, like they don't have, if we're doing a big plate of broccoli, like which we want them to have some, but if they're filling up on that, like there's not going to be room for the carbohydrates they need to give them the gas for the tank and perform at their best, right?
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think it's my favorite thing about sports nutrition is it kind of throws the table upside down on a lot of things we
It
thought were maybe
does.
that
It
maybe aren't
does.
aren't so. What should talk to a parent who suspects that their child's, or a coach that is thinking that their player might be, restricting food to make weight, or is really having some kind of concerning behaviors around food? What would be your recommendation to them and what they should do?
Yeah, I mean, I would say first and foremost, be honest with your child, right? Talking about it is important. Now, choosing when you talk about it is important too. That's probably not the best conversation for a family dinner, right? Talk to your child in private. And I think one of the most important things to do when we're talking to our kids is tell them what you notice. So like be very very clear like I have seen that you're skipping breakfast, or I have seen that you're doing extra laps in the pool. Tell me about that, right? So we don't want to be like, you always miss dinner or you're always cutting out calories. So
Yeah.
try to avoid those type of statements and be more stick to the facts. Like, what have you noticed? What are your concerns? I'm concerned. Like, this is crucial for your health. Like, it's not just about your performance, it's about your health. And I'm worried. And so I think that's like one of the biggest things. And I will also tell parents, like, be ready for them to deny it. That's part of this as well, right? And it's a hard conversation. And likely you're going to have to bring it up again, but bring up what you've noticed, make it clear that you care about them, that you want to help, and that we're going to seek help. Because most importantly, like this is something that it's not on you alone. It's a team approach, right? We want athletes to get help, not only from a dietitian, but also from someone in the mental health side so that they can be addressing those concerns as well.
Yeah, I love that, Mandy. And I love your sage advice from a parent of teenagers, much like myself. They're going to deny it. It's like, did you brush your teeth? Did you do your chores? You should just expect that.
100%.
Yeah, surrounding yourself with the right support system. And I think that's what's so powerful about having the right team of coaches
Yeah.
around even our young athletes, is making sure they're getting the support that they need, because this is about their health. And we
Mhm.
want to support, healthy growth and development, because as much as we focus on performing at a young age, it's even more important that we focus on investing in the health of these young kiddos, because they may not be Spurs
Correct.
basketball players, but someday they may go be parents of their own and run their own household and have their own values around
100%.
food that they're going to have to share. I love that. So who would you talk to first? Would you go to a pediatrician? Would you talk to a sports dietitian? Like, would you seek out a mental health expert? How would you, as an expert, really build that out once you are able to have those meaningful conversations with your child and understand that they need support?
I truly believe like it should start with a medical professional. So either your pediatrician or a sports medicine doctor. That's really where it should start because they're going to, unfortunately, if it's gone on long, there could be some immediate health risks that need to be
Mm.
addressed first. So we want that physician to really identify that and then they can help coordinate care. I have an amazing physician here in San Antonio, Dr. Fitch, shout out to you. He does a phenomenal job of just identifying kiddos at risk and referring them. That being said, if you don't have a pediatrician or a sports medicine doctor, start anywhere. Because if you're going to a qualified sports dietitian or a sports psychologist, they can help loop you in as well. As I mentioned earlier, we want a treatment team around your athlete. So a sports medicine doctor or your pediatrician. sports dietitian, and then a mental health expert to really address all aspects. And although, eating disorders, the symptoms we see are food, it's important to remember that first and foremost, it is a mental health disorder, right? So we need to be addressing those factors alongside working on your meal plan and addressing the calorie deficit.
What are some of the most common impacts or side effects of prolonged eating disorders as our parents think about like, oh, okay, this
Yeah.
doesn't seem that, maybe it's not that big of an issue, or
Yeah.
how truly our parents and coaches that are listening understand what are the long-term implications and risks if these disordered eating patterns, which could turn into an eating disorder, aren't treated.
Well, first and foremost, I think one thing we should talk about in female athletes is the stopping of the menstrual cycle or irregular menstrual cycle. And so that I always tell female athletes, like, that is a red flag. That's your body's warning sign going off if your menstrual cycle stops, because that's a sign of inadequate underfueling, inadequate calorie intake. And that disruption in your hormones, your estrogen levels, will lead to impact on bone health. Unfortunately, there's a myth, it's a common perception amongst female athletes, sometimes even physicians share, like, it's normal during the season not to have your period. Like, it's not normal. And so I think we need to really work hard on dispelling that myth, is that female athletes, no matter how active, if you're fueling your body appropriately, you should have a normal menstrual cycle. So, once again, that disruption of hormones long term, that could turn into fertility issues. In male and female athletes, long term disordered eating can have a really great impact on bone density, a really harmful impact on that. Could be cardiovascular issues, because underfueling will weaken the heart muscles. We may see arrhythmias. Mental health impacts, we already talked about that, but this can lead into chronic anxiety or depression, which is really concerning. And then the other thing I just want to point out is that eating disorders have one of the highest mortality rates of any mental illness. So this is truly a health concern, right? And something that we really want to address with our athletes. And that's why those early warning signs, it's so key to just jump on that as soon as possible.
Yeah. Thank you so much for articulating that so well for our listeners. I am so grateful you're here. This is a very important topic. We're able to share it and with your level of expertise. So thank you for just articulating that so well. I want to talk for a minute about the role of parents and coaches. How can parents and even coaches help support performance as we think about food as fuel without sending a message that thinner is better?
Yeah, and that's so hard, right? So I would say, like, first and foremost, let's not equivalate success with body weight, right? And I like to keep my athletes off the scales as much as possible. Now, I recognize that some sports, such as wrestling, you're weighing in for a competition. That's a must, right? But outside of that, I really like to use the scale only for hydration purposes, so that I can know if you're weighing in, weighing out before a soccer practice, so I know your hydration. That's one thing. But there's not an ideal weight for a universal ideal weight for someone's going to compete at. And unfortunately, what I see a lot of times is that when athletes are really focused on losing weight to ideally perform better, they lose muscle, and that hurts performance. And so we're not going to be performing. So I would say one is, let's take the focus off of the weight and place it onto performance. We talked about framing that food is fuel, right? So really focusing on, like, what are we doing before activity to fuel our performance? What are we doing after to help our bodies recover? And then emphasizing performance, not appearance. Like, how we perform is what matters, not our appearance, right? And that can be hard, but really changing it. We worked with one team, me and another sports psychologist. And one of the things we worked on with that team was no body talk. We're not talking about bodies. We're focusing on, like, how you perform. You're strong out there. I could say how powerful you are. I can see you're recovering faster, and thus you're training harder. But we're not talking about bodies. We're not talking about how you yourself look in your uniform. You're not going to talk about someone else. Think how many comments we make that are so superficial. Even just like how your hair looks that day, right?
Mandy, this is a topic. And the reason this is so near and dear to me is, as a dietitian, raising even young sons who have very different builds, it's hard for me to hear people talk about kiddos on a 12-year sports team's bodies because, and my youngest son, we have this conversation all the time. He's like, he's built like my family. We build muscle really quickly. I did powerlifting in high school. He's strong, he's fast. So we talk about what his body can do.
Yeah.
And instead of focusing on, like, our bodies look different, because athletic bodies come in all shapes and sizes.
100%. 100%.
I can just see so much of ourselves, the coaches, just having conversations about young children's bodies that I wish we would keep to ourselves. Those are thinking thoughts.
Right. Well, and so often, especially with kiddos, just when they hit their peak growth spurt, like, like
Yeah.
it's just so varied, right? And so they may just be perfect for where they are, and then when they're going to grow into it and their body weight, their shape is going to change. And so, but we do spend a lot of time focused on that, and we need to take the focus onto performance, onto health, and off of possibly what we look like in our uniform.
And on to behaviors. I think we focus
Well,
a lot on this. I'll see a lot of younger kids whose parents will bring them pre-puberty, which is always concerning for me because, pre-puberty, they can carry a little bit of extra weight as they're preparing for
absolutely.
puberty. And that's very normal. And, my big focus is, okay, are we eating our fruits and vegetables? Are we getting whole grain? Are we sleeping?
Mhm.
Your point earlier, like, what's our overall sort of dietary approach
Yes.
and lifestyle
Yes.
look like? Let's really focus on that. And as we
Right.
focus on that and they get through puberty, some of those other
Yeah.
things will work themselves out.
100%. 100%. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, talk a little bit about how coaches can create. So you talked about sort of ourselves as parents, as family. I guess two things I
Yes.
would say in here. What language would you use around food weight and body image? And like you talked a little bit about what to avoid or talk more about sort of the language or the semantics of it. Like we probably shouldn't be talking about ourselves or others' body weight. Like that isn't something we should hyper focus on. And if we are going to address this as parents, as coaches, like what words should we be using and how should we be really framing or thinking about some of these situations if like we notice a child is in need of additional support?
Yep, absolutely. I do think you said something really important that I want to capitalize on is that we're role models as well, coaches as well. So just be careful about what you're saying about your own bodies or even athletes on your team. Like just be really cautious because kids are listening all the time, right? So if we're commenting about, we feel overweight or we feel heavy in these jeans, like, we need to be mindful that kids are watching and kids are listening to that. I think language that we can be using is, asking them about how do they feel, right? Tell me how you feel. Like, after you ate breakfast today, did you feel like you had a lot of energy for the day ahead? Tell me what that felt like. Did you feel powerful out on the court today? Or did you feel like you were slow and tired? Did you feel like you were underfueled? I think once again, we go back to that food as fuel and tell me
Mm.
how you're feeling. And I think that can be really helpful. I think as coaches, as much as difficult as it may be, it's best to stay away from giving nutrition advice, from giving advice on body weight or body composition. Just surround yourself with a team of professionals that can really support you in that. And I would just say try to, as much as possible, avoid giving any recommendations on nutrition or what they should be eating or doing, especially around, body weight, body composition.
The same way I'm trying to stay away from what muscle groups they should work and how long they should work
Correct.
because that is
Absolutely.
not my
I'll let
area
them
of expertise.
coach.
Talk a little bit about what coaches can do to create a culture where we're really thinking about performance and we're building each other up as a team versus maybe focusing on some of these things we might tend to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like, coaches can build some of the best relationships that kids have, right? Like we look back on coaches we had in our youth and the
Mhm.
relationships that they built with us. And they focused on our goals and our interests and what our aspirations are, both on and off the court, right? And so I think that that's number one is just building those relationships with your individual players. But then I think you can also foster that amongst your teammates and how that they can focus and build one another up, right? In positive ways. I do kind of go back to create that culture, that team culture that doesn't focus on body image, no body talk, right? Celebrate what our athletes can do performing on the field, but not our appearance, right? Taking that away, I think is really important.
So, in that vein, I have to ask the question, are regular weigh ins on teams ever appropriate? And if so, who should handle them?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. We talked about like wrestling or something. You have to weigh in for competition, right? So that aside, I would say the biggest use that I see of weigh-ins is for hydration purposes. So summers in Texas are hot, so we may need to weigh our soccer players in before and after an activity. Or cross country, we may need to do it with our cross country runners because they're sweating a lot. We want to make sure they're rehydrating. But weights are sensitive, right? And so I think there's always a great opportunity to collaborate with your athletic trainer. That is ideally the best person to be doing these weigh in and weigh outs. And I've worked with teams where we do blind weigh in weigh outs, right? So they're backwards on the scale. They don't see the scale
Mm.
weight. So all they know is their change in body weight. Like you lost 2 pounds today in practice. So thus we need to drink this much fluid to rehydrate before the next practice. So I think there are definitely ways that weigh in and weigh out can be used for hydration purposes without compromising what, might be a trigger for an athlete.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one. It stuck with me because I was speaking to one of my athletes yesterday and he had started a new training program and they weigh the athletes before and after, but they don't give them any I said, "Oh, is it for hydration?" Because that was my first thought, Mandy,
Yeah.
was that clearly they're weighing you and giving
Mm.
hydration recommendations. And he's like, "No, they just weigh us pre and post and tell us." And I'm like, "That feels really dangerous."
Right. 100%. 100%. I think that what do they do with that information? And if especially if it's
Right.
someone who is, already focused on the scale, we wanna take that focus off the scale, right? I also like to use it as a tool with my athletes. If they're doing a blind weigh in, weigh out, and okay, they lost 4 pounds today during their cross country run. I think it can be a really educational piece for our athletes that you're so caught up on this number on the scale, but do you see that your weight can fluctuate by 4 pounds just by a workout, right? What does this number even mean, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I like to say if we're using the scale, we're only using it for hydration purposes because really, other than that, yeah.
Speaking of that, because you've done this for a long time, you've seen a variety of athletes from young to collegiate to
Yep.
professional athletes. Talk about some of the most severe swings you've seen in body weight change due to hydration, because I think it would be
Yeah.
fascinating for our audience to hear.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's one of the things is like, that is where I will have athletes I start working with weigh in pre-post practice or pre-post a
Mhm.
game so that
Mhm.
we can get a better sense of sweating and how they sweat. Can you just talk about all of
Yep.
that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest swing I've seen is a 9-pound drop in a 2-hour practice.
Oh
But
my
I
gosh,
will tell
that's
you
amazing.
that's huge, right? Like, and you think about how much fluid they need to consume to rehydrate. But the biggest swing that one of my NFL colleagues shared with me, she had a player lose 14 pounds. Now, these are big guys, right? So they have,
Yeah.
but 14 pounds is a massive amount of fluid losses. So once again, if we go back to what does this number on the scale really mean, right? It kind of puts it in perspective.
Yeah, for sure. No, thank you for that. I think that's such a good reminder. Being really mindful, we hyper focus on some of these numbers sometimes that don't mean as much.
No,
There's other things
no.
we could be hyper focusing on. I'm going to ask a quick question around body composition and sort of
Mhm.
anything that you're doing in that space as you think about weight and body composition with your athletes as they're looking to build muscle mass. Can you talk a little bit about this with our parents, coaches, and athletes and kind of what to focus on, what not to focus on? We talk a lot about BMI not really being a great indicator
Yeah.
for many of our young athletes. You're welcome to touch on that one too, but I'd love your
Yep.
take on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do prefer body composition for tracking changes in an athlete's body if they're trying to gain weight or lose weight, either way. Because what I'm really focused on with my athletes is ensuring that they're putting on lean mass. That's the goal. So we can measure that with body composition testing. And if they need to lose body fat, we can make sure that what they are losing as they lose weight is body fat, right? I will say at the, middle school levels, probably even the high school level, do we need body composition measurements? Probably not, right? Let's focus on how we're performing on the field, right? How much energy do you feel? Are you getting stronger, right? Are you just getting stronger in the weight room when you're doing your weight lifts, right? Like that's plenty. That's going to tell us, the information we need to know. As we get into the high school and definitely professional levels, we're going to do a DEXA test or something that's going to give us a better measurement of body composition. I 100% agree with you on BMI is not a good indicator for our athletes. It's really height to weight, and our athletes ideally have a lot of muscle mass. That's what we want for them, right? And so that's going to put them into a high BMI category that's can be very, very misleading. So avoid those BMI calculators online. Is probably not giving you the information you need for your athletes. That being said, a great tool we have for young athletes is the growth charts. And so that's where our pediatricians can really be on the front lines. Is that if you have an athlete who has been tracking along that same growth curve, height and weight, and all of a sudden you see a dip, that's not normal, right? If they're going backwards on the growth chart, like there should be questions on why that weight is going backwards. That's where, like I said, our pediatricians to be on the front line to start asking questions and refer as appropriate, because that can be a really helpful indicator for us. Especially, I see it like in our young gymnasts. If we start seeing them going backwards on the growth chart, like we need to be really cognizant of that.
Yeah, that's a really great call out and reminder of just the power of the collective healthcare team surrounding you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Mandy, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much. You are a wealth of information. We're going to have you back just to talk all the fun stories that you have from your nutrition because I know they're great. Anything you would leave our listeners with that you didn't get to cover that you would say about this topic?
I think we hit on a lot of it. I would just say like just the benefit of fueling young athletes. If they're fueling appropriately, they're going to be able to consistently do high quality training, right? They're going to reap the benefits of those training. They're going to get stronger. They're going to get faster, everything that they desire if we're getting the right nutrition into them. Fewer missed days, less injuries, healthier athletes. I've had athletes tell me like, Mandy, I forgot what it feels like to feel good. And so like, those are just, that's the power of food and the power of good nutrition. And so, I, I just love what you're doing with the podcast, Stacey. I think you're doing an amazing job fueling young athletes mentally, physically, spiritually. And so like, just a shout out to you and the great work you're doing. And I just hope to see it continue to grow.
Oh, thank you, Mandy. We love it. I'm very passionate about it, myself and my partner, Lindsay. The last question I'll ask you, I ask everyone is, do you have a favorite Bible quote or verse that you would leave our athletes with as you think about this space?
Yeah, absolutely. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, for sure. Absolutely. One to
I
always
love
lean on.
Yeah, that's a great one. Well, thank you so much, Mandy. I appreciate your time with us today. Again, a wealth of knowledge, and I appreciate you sharing it amidst a busy season. So thank you.
Thank you, Stacey.
Stay tuned for more real world tips and conversations with coaches, athletic directors, current and former collegiate and professional athletes, sports dietitians, sports psychologists, and other performance experts.
If this episode gave you something to chew on, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe. Nutrition is important, but let's be honest, we've all got to eat. So help us feed this podcast so we can keep fueling you.
Don't forget to join the Span Athletics community to get more exclusive content by following us on all of our social media platforms, including TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and X at @span_athletics.
Until next time, stay faithful, stay fueled, and remain focused on your goals.